everyone. I'm really excited to welcome back a familiar face, to me at least, and to have Natalie Kristina back on the podcast. And Natalie was our first ever guest all the way back in episode 2. And this is going to be episode 30 something, I think, when it comes out. And a couple of weeks ago, I mentioned Natalie because I did one of Natalie's workshops on relationships. And actually, Natalie doesn't know this yet, but we've just revamped our website and I've put a kind of recommend page. And obviously, we've got our own speciality here, but we're not experts in everything. And Natalie's thing is relationships. So she is our recommended person. If you have any relationship stuff that you're working through, there's a link to Natalie there so you can find her. So I haven't told you that before, but welcome, Natalie.
Wow. Well, thank you. That is, oh my goodness. You said you weren't going to make me cry.
Sorry.
Starting already. No, that is so sweet of you. I'm really excited to be back. And it's pretty cool even just thinking that episode 2 to episode 30 and how much you and I have connected through that time from just having met online. And I really appreciate you holding space for us to talk today more specifically about my journey, which I'll let you do more of an introduction to, because it's not always that I get a chance to do that because I specialize in talking about relationships. So I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about the other nuances that have brought me to where I am as a relationship coach, but also have just been integral in my development on my own independent journey as well.
Yeah. And I mean, obviously the relationships, I'm sure there was way more that we could talk about around that as well. But yes, Natalie is back for a bonus episode. So a few months ago, we did a special episode for bipolar awareness. We did one for Time to Talk Day. So kind of, shining a light on specific experiences that might have an impact on mental well-being. So we're back for another one of these, and we're going to be talking about MS today. So for anyone who's listening who maybe is like, what is that? Maybe they've heard the term, they're not really sure what it is. I wonder if, before we dive into your journey and your experience, if you could just tell us a little bit about what MS is.
Yes, so I will do my job as a non-doctor, sharing my understanding of what MS is. So MS or multiple sclerosis, is an autoimmune condition. And more generally speaking, autoimmune are conditions where your body attacks itself. And so in the case of MS, my body attacks I hope I pronounce this right, the glial cells, which make up the myelin sheath on the nerves, which carry neural impulses. And so it's a neurodegenerative disease. With that, I will share, I specifically have RRMS, which is relapsing remitting multiple sclerosis. And there are also way more types of MS than I even am actually aware of, which I think probably will bring us to other parts of this conversation that'll come up. But I think it's been really important for me with MS to recognize, and I think for anyone else ever talking with someone who might have MS to realize that there are so many different types. And so people are with the same, in air quotes, same illness are living very different types of experiences. And then even within each type of that, it can present in very different explicit ways or silent ways. And so that's always something that I try to be aware of. And so I want to also preface with, I'm sharing strictly from my experience. And I recognize that in a lot of ways, I've been very fortunate along my journey so far. And there are so many different experiences, different symptoms that people with MS have. And it's just something to keep in mind, I think, because it's easy to kind of pigeonhole into what our comprehension might be. And even for myself, right? But there's so much outside of that. And I'm always learning from other people who have walked this journey as well.
I think that's true for, any condition or illness that you have. I recorded an interview talking about depression the other day. And actually, I was asked the sort of same question, but for depression. And for that, again, there are different types or different presentations. So I think, obviously, yes, we're talking about your experience and there may be some parallels for other people. But I think that is a really important thing to remember, that it's not just 100% going to be the same experience. It's going to be different for everyone. So, yeah. So I wonder if you could tell us about your journey, how you got to this point in your life, I guess. With your MS journey. With your MS journey. I mean,
yeah, absolutely. No, I call it that all the time. That's like my favorite hashtag. So Oh man, it was back in 2013, if I remember correctly, is when it started. So we're in 2020 now, in the spring. And I remember I was working at Starbucks in downtown Toronto, and I had this weird thing happen. And for anyone who has seen me, I have giant holes in my earlobes. So the strange thing that was happening, and the way I describe it, is I almost had like phantom earlobe pain. Like it felt like there was an itch in my earlobe where I don't have one anymore that I couldn't scratch. And it was the strangest phenomenon I've ever experienced. And then slowly it started to move kind of into my actual ear, along my jaw and my cheek, and gradually over, I think, 3 to 4 weeks, it spread down to my right collarbone and began to go down my shoulder. And what it was almost like topical numbness, and I would feel the itch under the surface, but I couldn't scratch it no matter what I did. And like, I remember scratching on my jaw, like specifically along my jawbone, because it was so itchy and uncomfortable. But I would scratch so hard, feel nothing on the surface, but it would get to the point that I felt like intense pain in my bone from how hard I was pushing. And I remember being in the shower and feeling the water on my face, but I could only feel it on half of my face, not the other side. And, you know, I was 19, 20 years old, I think. And even though I'd already been diagnosed with another health condition, because autoimmune like to come in pairs or more, I still was like, oh, it's fine. Like it's getting better. It'll go away. And I actually had a customer who I remember her and I had a really special bond, and she kind of questioned me, and she was like, well, you know, it could be something like a mini stroke. You really should go to the doctor. And I think, honestly, for me, I was pretty terrified to go to the doctor, because the last time I'd gone to the doctor for something I didn't think was that serious, I'd ended up in the hospital for 3 days and my life changed forever. And that was my type 1 diabetes diagnosis. And so the thought of going through that again, I was naturally, I think, quite resistant to. But she said that, and I sat with it, and I realized, you know, I need to go get this checked out. So I booked an appointment it was my campus doctor at the time. And because I was at university, I booked an appointment with my campus doctor, and I went to see her. And I always describe her as being like, I swear she was an angel in my life, because she was the same doctor who diagnosed me with diabetes. And it was like, I went to see her. She figured it out within 30 seconds. She paid for my cab to the hospital, which was 2 blocks away, because she said it was not safe for me to walk alone. And I was a poor and somewhat irresponsible student who did not have money for a cab. And she made that happen. She called me on the weekend to make sure I was okay. And so this day, when I went to her with this sensation, her initial thought was Lyme disease, which I guess can present with some similar types of symptoms to what I was experiencing. So she ordered a blood panel, but she actually got me in to see a neurologist down the street from the clinic that day. So I left her, I went and I walked down the street like maybe 5 blocks and got in with a neurologist. And this is where, like I said in the beginning of our talk, I was so fortunate, because a lot of people I talk to, and especially depending where you're located and what the medical system is like, that is unheard of. Like that just does not happen. And so I'm very grateful that I think she'd been a doctor in the community for quite some time, and she had some good ties to other professionals, because, you know, it really did expedite my journey that way. And so I went, and he ordered more blood work and also an MRI. And so that kind of got the ball moving. And I went for the MRI. I can't remember the timeline, honestly. I think there were so many shifts in my life in that year and a half, like diabetes, got sober, MS, all within 12 months. And so it's really foggy. And I think also because it was pretty emotionally taxing without me necessarily realizing it as I was just going through the motions. But I do remember it being fairly quick, because I got the MRI, went back, and then I got called back to see that neurologist, which generally is not a good sign when you get called back for your test results. And it was on a Thursday in September that same year. And I went back and he kind of sat me down and the room got silent. And I just, it's like, it feels surreal, like thinking back to that moment. There was this weird disconnect, but it was like all the energy in the room just centered onto him, just like, and it kind of closed in around me. And I remember him saying very nondescript, which was great at the time, sarcasm right there. You have multiple abnormalities along your spine and brain. And like my first reaction was like, do I have tumors all up and down my spine? Like, what are you talking about? Because I think he was coming at it having an inkling of what this could be. I had been given no information because they're really not supposed to give you much information until the end of the results. And my symptoms were not as clear cut as maybe some people's would be. Right. And so I didn't know anything. And so he says, this was like, okay, but what are you talking about? And and that's when he said, I am not someone who can tell you, because he wasn't an MS specialist. Like he didn't specialize as a neurologist. But he said, it looks like it could be MS and I'll be sending you to a specialist and I'll send you a referral. And I know we had chatted a bit before this about kind of like the emotional mental journey, but I honestly don't think that I don't know if that moment will ever fully catch up as I'm talking it through to you right now, because I think I just went into kind of that survival mode. And what I do remember is when I left, I felt numb and overwhelmed all at the same time. And I called I think my partner at the time, because he had known what was going on, to let him know that this was the next step. This is what's happening. And then I called my stepdad to let him know. And he told my mom. And all my sensory memory is like blur, but I know from him telling me at least that she collapsed to the floor screaming, because, it's my mom. Like she was devastated and so scared for me, and living in a different province. It's like she couldn't come hug me. She couldn't be there. Right. And that's heartbreaking, I think, for any parent. And then I remember the next thing I did, and this was the big turning point, was I reached out to someone I met up with earlier that day who ended up being kind of my first mentor along my sober journey. And I confirmed that she'd be at this event I was planning to go to that night, because I knew I needed to reach out for help, because I didn't want that part of my growth to, I don't want to say backtrack, but I knew I didn't want to go into how I used to cope with this diagnosis. Because with diabetes, I threw myself into drinking and anything else I could do to just escape having to process these things and escape, accepting what my reality was becoming going forward. And I didn't want to have to go through that again. And so I reached out for help. And I think that was a huge shift. And to be able to move, we'll talk more mindset later, but to be able to create the shifts in mindset around the diagnosis that I gradually have over time since then. And so I guess leading up to diagnosis, I'm a weird one. My diagnosis was very gradual. And I think because, I don't know, I can't say for certain. I think because my symptom, like that initial, they call it a clinically isolated syndrome, when you have your first episode, and they normally last 4 to 6 weeks. So it's not generally that you'll have this thing show up and it lasts for years and years. They actually look for the 4 to 6 week window a lot of the time. I'll also say that the diagnostic criteria in different countries varies. So here it's displacement over space and time. So you need to have multiple physical markers on an MRI. It doesn't necessarily have to be blood work. I think in the States, you need blood work. I'm up in Canada, just for reference. And over time, meaning I had this one clinically isolated syndrome, and then will there be a next one? So when I went to the MS specializing neurologist, I don't know what the word is for that. Anyway, that guy, he basically said that because I already had another autoimmune condition, given the things that they had seen in my physical symptoms, my MRI, my likelihood of this being MS increased from 15% to about 85%. So I think that was his really gentle way of telling me you have MS. because a year later, I moved to Vancouver. I'd had another MRI since then, because I think they monitored me a bit more frequently than they now do, just to see how things went. And after that MRI, I had a bout of vertigo that lasted about 5 weeks. And when I went to see this new neurologist, I kind of asked her, I was like, so do I have MS? And she's like, what do you mean, do you have MS? Like, yeah, you do. I'm like, well, I think he was just being nice because he told me this. And she's like, no, you do. However, in most people's circumstances, that vertigo might not count as a second occurrence. But because of me being also diabetic, she wanted to get me on a medication now that it had been a year and I kind of adjusted. And I think because they weren't as concerned in a sense, they didn't push me onto a medication right away. But she said that now that that had happened, that was going to count as my next one. And so within about a month of that, I started my medication, which is Copaxone.
Do you think that having that, I guess, more gradual diagnosis of it's maybe an 85% chance, maybe gave you a chance to come to terms with it a bit more gradually rather than someone just saying, yeah, this is what it is?
I think it did in a sense. It's kind of ebbed and flowed both ways. Like, I think, yeah, I'm kind of grateful that I was given that space so I could gradually, hold on to the tools and do some research and feel into it. At the same time, I think that 15% I was kind of holding on to was like, well, maybe it's not, right? Like, maybe. And actually my poor mother, because I had told her the 85%, and I think it was like a year and a half ago now, and it's been like 6 or 7 years, that she was like, wait, so you do have it? Like, yes, Mom. Yes, I have it. Like, I've been on medication for 6 years now. I have it. And so similar for her, like that 15% became 100, and so it's definitely gone both ways. But I think that even just with the physical symptoms that I've experienced, it's similar. It's given a bit of both, but definitely having that space, I think, when I was already in a very emotionally, I don't want to say unstable, but just not as secure in my foundational supports as I am now, right? It gave me time to really solidify in those so that I could move forward with that diagnosis more safely, really. Because like I said, for me, like sobriety was definitely at the forefront of my thought. And I think it helped so that I didn't jeopardize that, which has been really important moving forward. Yeah.
And I think you said that you reached out to a friend who had been that mentor with your sobriety to sort of say that you would need help kind of going forward. And I think that's I imagine must have been quite difficult to have that conversation, but I guess such a powerful thing to have made that connection early on and put it in place so that when you get to a point where you're like, I really need help now, you've had that difficult conversation about what's going on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And she ended up being kind of the first person I told any of this to. And I as you're asking me, I remember standing in the entrance to the subway at Yonge and Eglinton in Toronto, having this conversation with her and just crying. And it's, at least for me, a lot of times when I first say something out loud, like I remember the first time moving on my sober path when I acknowledged that, like, I had a problematic relationship with alcohol. I just cried. I'm a crier. It's just a thing that happens. But for me, that's kind of part of that acceptance and showing up for it. And she held space for that. And that was really needed and still really difficult.
I think there's something powerful, isn't there, about putting stuff into words that maybe it's been kind of swirling around in your head, but when it's put into words, it feels more real or more concrete. So I guess then, the emotions come with it because suddenly it's just there. It's just out in the room to come to terms with.
No, absolutely. Yeah.
So now you have your official diagnosis and you have medication and we can come back to medication because I know that there's maybe some more to say about that and how that journey is going. But there was something that you said, so like you said, you've been posting about your MS journey, and there was something that you said about it being an invisible illness and that people who don't have it don't get it. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about that and about maybe some of the misconceptions that people have, or if there are things that people have said to you that you really just like, you don't understand this at all.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I think one, it's misunderstood in general. Like, I think you really can't understand living with an illness fully until you've had it. And it's just like any, subjective experience. And I think invisible illnesses, oh my goodness, whether it be, neurodiversity or in my case, neurodegeneration, it's tricky that way because I can't articulate to someone, and there's that spoon theory, but like what fatigue is like. It's not just tired. And I've shared with my partner a couple times because there's definitely been moments where he's kind of like, okay, but, and because full disclosure, if I am feeling super fatigued, can I talk about this in here? I don't have much of a sex drive. No sex drive. It's just not a thing. Honestly, it's exhausting to even have to lift my arm up to get out of bed. Like, that's how it feels. And I'm sure people can relate to that from many different backgrounds in terms of fatigue, depressive state, whatever it might be. But until you've known that level for yourself, like it's not something easily articulated, because it's not like I can show it to you, right? And I've definitely had conversations with people before where I was having things like this happen, and I had one time like cramping in my legs, and it was really, really bad. And my neurologist said that it didn't sound neurological, so it wasn't linked to MS. That being said, all autoimmune is kind of antagonized by inflammation. And so it might not be directly causal, but it could be correlated in some way. And I was fine to stand still. I could stand and move on the spot. But at the time I was living up this huge hill. And if I would try to walk up that hill, I would be so exhausted. Like, I just could not do it. And I remember them questioning me, being like, what are you talking about? Of course you can. And it's like, I can't explain this to you. Like, it's not my job to have to explain that to someone. Like, if I tell you I can't walk up the freaking hill, let me be. Like, I know my limits, right? And for me, that's also been a big shift because I'm someone who used to push myself all the time, hence that I did not want to go to the doctor for any of these things, and I've had to learn to check in with that. And that's been really difficult mentally to adjust to my new normal in that sense. But I think it's just like me realizing like I don't need to explain this to people, but also it's been hard at times to accept that they might not get it. And I think if something is visually in someone's face, they might not be able to fully comprehend your experience, but it might be easier for them to be like, oh, okay, I get what you're saying. Like, I'll leave that alone. But if it's something they also can't even see or observe for themselves, and they don't understand the subjective experience, it can be really difficult, I think, to create that space for that understanding in just understanding what the other person needs and kind of backing off, not understanding like they're going to know. Cause like I said, like that just can't happen. I don't want to I'm a broken record at this point, but yeah. So I think it's kind of been how to navigate that for myself. Right. And also acknowledge for myself. Cause like it's invisible to me too. So for me to actually sit there and be like, oh wait, I'm not just tired. Like this is more than that. I have to stop. Right. And then to have to explain it to another person, well, Lord, that's even more exhausting. And at that point, I just want to stay in bed all day.
Did you find that you had to deal with some resistance on your own part? Like you said, if you were someone who was always very active and pushing yourself, actually acknowledging, no, I am struggling with this. I need to look after myself a bit more. I need to rein it in. Did you find that a difficult thing for yourself to accept?
Yes, definitely. And it took time for me to know the difference between fatigue and just tired. And I think it's also been learning what causes fatigue. Like some people I hear about with MS, and this is where, like I said, it's a very individual journey. There's people with MS who are out there running marathons and that works for them. For me, I noticed at a certain point that I was more likely to get fatigued from going on like a pretty low key hike than I was from weight training 5 days a week. And that just has to do with probably inflammation in my body and how my body responds to that kind of activity. And so I had to make some adjustments because I used to be a very like cardio heavy person. Then I got into weight training, like, well, I shouldn't say weight training, like powerlifting and just more that sort of activity, some HIIT workouts, that sort of thing. And now I am at a place where for my day job, except for right now because I'm in quarantine. But usually when I'm at the office, I have a 45-minute walk home. And for me, like I said, the walking is a lot on my body. And I've had to definitely adjust my workout regime based on that. And it's been difficult to acknowledge. And I think as I started this job a bit over a year and a half ago, it's 9-hour days. It's not, 8 to 8.5-hour days. So that was already a lot. 45-minute walk home. So there's different compounding factors. And I had been going still to the gym 5 days a week for up to 2 hours because that's what my training looked like. And now I'm doing, even with being in quarantine, I'm not going out for walks and I may be doing 20 minutes of yoga a day. And I've had to make peace with that. And my body is different and my capabilities are different, but like, that's okay. But it's been hard, and it's been hard to let go of what my normal was and to get to a point where I can realize, that ebb and flow is all right. And it's more important to meet myself where I'm at and then figuring out what that looks like for me.
I think that's such an important idea of meeting yourself where you're at. I think for obviously someone who has a chronic condition, but just generally, I think we also sometimes don't meet ourselves where we are. We just kind of want to be, I don't know, where we were like 5 years ago or where we want to be in another 5 years. We struggle sometimes just to accept this is where I'm at, this is what I can do. I wanted to ask, so you're saying that you started this new role with long days. Are you quite open about your MS at work, and are they supportive? Do they try and accommodate if you need it?
A couple people know about it, but otherwise I haven't said anything. Personally, and also I work in insurance. So there's, there's that level that I kind of want to keep it discreet. But some people from the office follow me on social media, which is where I am very open. So they will know. But I also kind of trust that if someone is following me on social media, they're keeping those lines separate. I'm more open about my diabetes because for me, at least right now, that is what is more likely to influence my work day. Like if my blood sugar goes low at work, I need to get food right away, right? I'm checking my blood sugar at my desk because I don't really want to have to go to the bathroom every time. And so I've opened up about that more quickly. But MS, personally, I haven't felt reason to share. So at this point, I've kept it more or less to myself.
I suppose that's the thing, is that a personal thing, isn't it? And if you feel that it doesn't or isn't as likely to affect your work at the moment, they almost don't need to know in the same way. It's your thing to kind of own and to tell people on your terms and when you feel ready to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I've kind of alluded to certain things. Like I know we had touched on medication, and in this past year, I've had a lot of difficulties around my medication and some impacts of having had to switch for a month, and that's been really difficult. And I'd gone to the neurologist and this all had come up, and then I went back into work the next day and there was a lot going on, and so I definitely cried in my boss's office and let her know about everything, but I didn't tell her the explicit stuff. I just said, I've been on a medication, this is what happened, this is what I'm dealing with. I didn't tell her what the health thing was or any of that. Or like if I'm experiencing vertigo, I'll tell her I have vertigo. I'm a little out of it. If I seem, dizzy or not focused, that's what's going on. But I don't tell her that it's linked to MS specifically because, like you said, like that at the forefront, that's not really what is impacting